Stanford University.
Welcome to the David Rumsey Map Center and to the inaugural Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography. My name is Salim Mohammed, and I'm the head and curator of the center. I will return to speak more in just a bit, but for now, I call upon Mimi Coulter, Deputy University Librarian, to say a few words and do us the honor of inaugurating the conference.
Thanks very much, Salim. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here to the David Rumsey Map Center and to initiate this Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography. We're really thrilled to have to be able to host this event and to have you all here and to be able to host it in this facility, in this center, which we've worked on for so long. We opened this center a little more than a year ago, but going back, several years before that, when we were in the planning stages, we really did envision this as a place that could host scholars, that could host this kind of conference with scholars, with experts, where we could bring people together and give them access to the resources that they need, both technology resources, printed resources, and even the resources of access to each other and to experts that would really allow everybody to do the amazing things that we do. And hosting this conference really is the proof that we have managed to bring that vision to life in opening this center. So we're very pleased about this. It is my particular honor to thank our friend and sponsor, Barry Lawrence Ruderman. I think you all know Barry as a map and atlas dealer, but he's a longtime friend and supporter of the Stanford Libraries. Since 2009, Barry Lawrence Ruderman Antique Maps has contributed more than 50,000 digital map images to our Stanford Digital Repository, which is our online system which makes all of these materials available, our catalog and repository of digital resources. He has been a great supporter of our digital philanthropy program, in which we digitize materials, keep the digital copies available, and then return our printed copies to the donor. But he's just been a great friend in any number of ways. Although on the digital philanthropy front, I do want to note that a substantial portion of the maps that you're going to see during the conference are being unveiled online. They have been digitized. They'll be available in the library's online catalog and in an online exhibit that we've created to highlight this event and this program. So you'll be able to revisit online a lot of the materials that you're going to see. Thank you to Barry for that engagement. Barry is also one of the founding friends of the David Rumsey Map Center. And I know we have a couple of other founding friends of the Map Center here. So I actually want to thank all of the founding friends that we've got with us today. It's a fabulous thing. But Barry was certainly one of the first engaged on that in that founding friends circle. And we continue to be grateful for his support and for his ongoing engagement and development of our programs. And finally, though I believe he needs no introduction, I do want to introduce and thank our friend and colleague, David Rumsey. David is known to be many things. He's a collector, he's an author, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist. But I want to call out today his pioneering work as a spokesperson, a practitioner, and an innovator in the use of geospatial technologies and visualization techniques. That's really a lot of what has gotten us working together and working on this space and these kinds of events. Because of his work, global scholars have access to more than 150,000 maps, atlases, globes, and other cartographic materials that he's made digitally accessible. And he's been working closely with the library since at least 2008, when he made his decision, for which we are very grateful, to donate his map collection to the Stanford Libraries. And we've had a really fruitful working relationship with him since then. This, not least of which is on this center, which has had more than 3,000 visitors to date and has really become known as a campus destination. We get regular requests for not only for classes and the expected use of this space, but for tours, for visitors. It really highlights a lot of what's good, some of the interesting work that is going on at Stanford, and is a really great place to come, and very popular. And David is actively working with the center. He continues to be engaged and involved with us, and we're really thrilled that he's also able to be with us today. So thanks to Barry, thanks to David, and I'm going to ask David to come up and say a couple of words as well.
Thank you, Mimi. It is wonderful to see all of you here for the first biannual, I have to say, it's really Barry to me, but it's the Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography. We're so excited to see it beginning. As Mimi said, we all appreciate Barry's support and particularly his vision for how this conference can evolve, and we look forward to seeing many more of these in the future. The Ruderman Conference really embodies exactly what we hoped the Map Center's intellectual life would be, bringing together scholars and all of you who love maps to discuss a wide range of topics central to the history of cartography, but also to how maps are being used today in all of our societies. Indeed, looking at the conference program, which is amazing, that's certainly reflected. Starting tonight with our keynote speaker, Parag Khanna, who will be talking to us about how we map the newly connected world. And then continuing tomorrow and Saturday with 14 talks that address an impressive array of subjects, from cosmological imagination, map design, exploration, imperial power, colonial cities, Jesuit cartographers, technology and maps, maps and selective histories, from China, Japan, and Africa, mapping disease, how maps speak and work, and mapping Palestine. I think looking at this, the remarkable scope of mapping that will be revealed at this conference promises really exciting new uses of maps, and we look forward to supporting those uses in a continuous way at the center. So now I'll turn it over to Salim, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, David. I'm so pleased to see all of you here today. We've had a full house and a promising 2.5 days ahead. I also want to add my thanks to Barry Ruderman for sponsoring this conference and for partnering with the Rumsey Map Center to make this conference a reality. This is the first. As David mentioned, we expect to have this occur every other year. To commemorate the conference, as Mimi mentioned, we are unveiling 19,400 maps from the Barry Lawrence Ruderman Map Collection at Stanford. These are showcased at exhibits.stanford.edu/Ruderman, which is over there. In addition, all of the speakers at the conference curated a part of this exhibit, the exhibit that you see here today, and downstairs by the door. Because not everyone can make it to the center, we propagate those out via Spotlight at exhibits.stanford.edu/BLRCC. So other ways to get at these wonderful maps. It's never too early to thank our wonderful crew that put this conference together. We have Katie Parker from London. You'll hear her speak tomorrow. Jira Fazell, TJ Crusada, he's back in the room. Anna Christ. Special thanks, of course, to David Rumsey, Christina Konjevic, Sonia Lee, Gabriela Karampelas, Julie Sweet-Kind-Singer, Emily Prince, Wayne Vanderkool, and Becky Fischbach. A round of applause, please. Now on to our keynote speaker. Parag Khanna is a leading global strategist, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is a senior research fellow in the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He's also the managing partner of Hybrid Reality, a boutique geostrategic advisory firm and CEO of Factotum, an exclusive content branding agency. Parag's latest book is Technocracy in America, Rise of the Info State. He is the author of a trilogy of books on the future of world order, beginning with the Second World Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, followed by How to Run the World, charting a course to the next Renaissance, that's 2011, and concluding with Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization, that's 2016. This is a big reason why he's here today. He's also the co-author of Hybrid Reality, Thriving in the Emerging Human Technology Civilization. In 2008, Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century, and he was featured in Wired Magazine's Smart List. When we were looking for a speaker to keynote the conference, we wanted someone who thought spatially and was looking at radically different ways to interrogate geography through maps and think about space differently. Parag's take on rewriting maps based on how we are connected, rather than politics in geography, is a compelling way on how one might view the current century and how we might proceed to solve the world's problems. Maps by their very nature are interdisciplinary. Parag's book weaves connection, just not between places, but also between different academic disciplines. How appropriate it is then to have him speak here at this conference, at the Rumsey Map Center, and at Stanford, whose students and faculty strive hard to do interdisciplinary work. On that note, and without further ado, Parag Khanna on Mapping the Future.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Stanford has a very unique ability to erect structures that celebrate fundamental learning in new areas or old areas like cartography, and in doing so, put a discipline on the map for the future in ways that really inspire many others. So, I had some of you heard I had some difficulty getting here today. I was in Lake Tahoe just a few hours ago, but SFO was closed. So on the long drive over here, which was fortunately made brief by paying extra to the driver to break every speed limit imaginable, I had that bit of time to reflect on again, the ability that this university has to really change mindsets. And I think that this center, and with of course deep gratitude to David Rumsey for his generous donation to get it up and running, is a very, very powerful example of that. And of course to Barry Ruderman as well for sponsoring this event and making it possible for all of us to be together this evening. And to Salim, Mimi, Katie, thank you so much. By volume of correspondence over the last 1 year, I am very, very aware of how much work has gone into this, and I think it's an incredibly exciting opportunity. Sometimes when I think individual scholars are toiling on their own, even if it's digitally and working with the data sets they need, they may not feel necessarily, they may not feel as connected to all of the others out there that are now getting so interested in this approach and to cartography. But you've all made it possible for us to not only share lessons, but actually to celebrate it. So I hope that tonight what I can do is to join in, play my small part in kicking off what I think is not only a very important learning process, but also in a way a celebration. So let me dive right in, because I almost can't wait to get to the Q&A this evening with such a room of brilliant scholars assembled here. But what I want to do is to, in a way, tell a little bit of a story through some of the maps that I've been working on over the years, because of course I think here when I look at the program I see a deep dive into the evolution of cartography, and of course much of that content being deeply historical. That is not an area in which I can contribute. But when it comes to the evolution of the field, what I'm hoping is to reinforce some of the things that I know those of you who are looking at the future of the discipline, its interaction with technology, are working on. And that's an intersection that I'm very, very passionate about. So I'll show you some of the maps. Some are derived from Connectography, some are actually animated, and I'll give a shout out to some of the partners that I've been working with, who are very, very great fans of this center as well. So let me start actually with animation, because there's obviously a very difficult area in which to bridge GIS material, but also to constantly be trying to update data sets around certain categories of human activity. And so I want to focus right now on infrastructure, which is a very big theme in my work. This is an overlay of all of the world's major highways and railway systems. Often they run in parallel, of course. On top of that, you get all of the world's oil and gas pipelines and electricity grids. And then, of course, you've got, particularly in the last 25, 30 years, the world's fiber optic internet cable network. So in animating this, you get what is a sort of combined functional geography of the three principal categories of infrastructure: transportation, energy, and communications. And right there, you have an image that shows you our combined collective. It's actually still partial. I haven't put in all the airports and seaports and all the other things, all of the other infrastructures. But even just this glimpse right there, you have something that has that political science has more or less ignored for centuries. Right? And that wasn't really that hard to do. This was generated by Autodesk. Autodesk is a great Silicon Valley company, by far the leader in using or in advising on infrastructure projects, architecture, and so forth in the world. And they helped me put this together for my TED Talk last year. Oops, we're having a little bit of a glitch. Let me just jump forward again. Jump forward.
It's really sensitive.
It is very sensitive. Good thing you didn't give me that spotlight thing you were telling me about earlier. I'm a novice at that. So I liken this, again, if you do this in a sort of a time series kind of way, and you plot out the centuries of history, really the millennia of history, of human migratory patterns, of our coevolution with technology, from stone tools and really just cobblestone tracks to railways to fiber optic internet cables. This is centuries of layers, millennia of layers of infrastructural history that really form a very robust exoskeleton. I like to think of this as in a sort of organismic analogy sort of way, in which we take these layers of infrastructure, these categories of infrastructure, and we think about them as parts of a planetary body. Because when you do look at this mapped out over time, that's the way it starts to feel. And this is what I call the global connectivity revolution, if you will. And it's extremely important to think of it in this evolutionary sense of millennia of history in terms of the legacy of human migratory patterns, the human settlements, civilizations, their architectural or archaeological legacies, and how those have combined in a way and connected more and more to each other as our geographic reach has become more and more global, and resulted in the creation of a picture such as this. So I believe to understand that connectivity, to me, that is now really a fundamental reality in the global system. The connectivity of human societies to each other, connectivity of economic systems, the connectivity really also of our environmental systems in a way, is one of the key drivers of global complexity. Right? Complexity is something we all recognize that we are grappling with, even if we have a hard time deciphering specific situations. And one of the things about complexity is that connectivity is why the world is so complex. When we throw our hands in the air and we don't understand how could this happen, right? How could a stock market crash or an election of a certain leader or whatever the case may be, we have to think about all of the different variables, geographic origins, and factors. So for example, when people want to explain the financial crisis, you don't just look at what happened with mortgage lending rates in the United States. You have to look at the fact that foreign investment in purchases of American treasuries that kept interest rates low are a factor in that. So you would want to understand the rise of China and the Asian wealth funds that were buying American treasuries and keeping those interest rates low. Well, what caused that to happen? And then you start to map out these patterns and flows in the global economy that take you back decades in order to explain the present. If our systems weren't all so connected, it would be much simpler in a way to explain certain phenomena. Similarly, my view is that to understand global complexity, you have to take at least three different kinds of geography. The natural geography, which we don't dispute very often. We don't dispute. We take more for granted. Let's say how we map it. The color schemes that represent deserts, oceans, forests, and so forth. Natural geography. Political geography tends to, as a political scientist, I'm speaking now, obviously, but also as an observer, dominate most of what people think of, again, most people, when they think of geography. These are the maps that hang in all of our children's classrooms. We are raised from birth to the boardroom, from birth to the boardroom. These are the maps. 99.9% of all the maps hanging in public or private spaces in the world is some version of some Rand McNally map. So I believe that this is the greatest brainwashing in all of human history, because maps are, of course, our foremost visual tool for explaining the world. And for centuries, we have, in a default way, defaulted to political maps. And so we grow up thinking and never questioning the idea that division is the natural order of things, that we as mankind tend towards division, whether it's tribal, religious, other kinds of ways of separating ourselves from each other. And yet that's not really the meta pattern of human history if you go back as far back as you can. Again, if you go back 60,000, 70,000 1,000 years to our sort of migratory wanderings across the continents, it's been actually a constant effort to use the technological tools available to build connections to other societies. And I think that that's why functional geography is an important layer in addition to the political, in addition to the natural. And again, this field has been very much neglected. Salim mentioned how important the sort of interdisciplinary character of this enterprise is for all of us. And I've had to take this terminology from architecture, right, from urban studies, and to find a way to translate it into geopolitics, which is really my field, which tends to work much more in these two categories of natural and political geography. And yet today, I don't think you can understand much of anything useful about 21st century geopolitics without understanding the functional geography dimension. And again, there's so much about this that is about technology. It's the tools that we have available today to conduct the topographical engineering that has made functional geography, that has made infrastructure such a pervasive reality, that has such an impact on our economic, strategic, geopolitical kinds of systems. So I like this quote by the architect Santiago Calatrava. He says, "What we build today will last for centuries." And of course, he meant it as a paean, as a homage in a way to the great architectural monuments that he and other starchitects are building today around the world. I actually take it to be completely literal, because the robustness, if you will, the longevity, the durability of pipelines, internet cables, all these kinds of things are actually far more, have a far greater durability than much of what today is central to political geography, because there are states that have ceased to exist in the last couple of years or generation. If you think about the Arab Spring, under whose soil or above whose soil passed these pipelines that were built in the early 20th century. So actually, functional geography in many ways is becoming more immutable than the political geography that we tend to think of as so sacred and sacrosanct. So it's ironically enough, as someone who's trained in political geography, it's become my mission to overturn it in every possible way. So the pace of this topographical engineering, which is a very important term that comes really from military history. If you go back to the Lewis and Clark expeditions that brought American settlements across this great continental landmass, and U.S. military and other military expeditions that sort of help to pave the necessary infrastructures for military planning and expansion and so forth. That topographical engineering, that capacity is improved obviously with our technological tools, and it's made connectivity, if you will, connectivity being almost a term that we think of as being so ethereal and wireless, if you will, and yet every instance of human connectivity, of interaction, again, whether it's between people or within societies, other than just face-to-face contact, requires actually some physical infrastructural foundation in order for it to actually transpire. To take a simple statistic, 75-80% of world trade occurs between countries that do not share a border, right? And even if they do share a border, you still need infrastructure across that border to enable that trade. And then 75%, the vast majority of world trade in goods, of course, occurs between countries that do not border each other. How would it be possible? And then, of course, leapfrogging into the 21st century of digital technology, how would we have, obviously, the global communications without actually the physical underpinning of the internet, which again, a lot of people take for granted as a wireless thing, but it is nothing of the sort. It is very, very physical. And if you don't map that functional geography, you certainly don't appreciate it. And so we have actually a crisis of underinvestment in infrastructure in this country and in many places around the world globally to cope with the infrastructural needs of the majority of the world's population. So in any case, my view of connectivity is that it, in fact, is a very physical thing, and that these categories of infrastructures that together combine to make up connectivity are really helping us to overturn this ancient adage with which we're all familiar. Geography is destiny. Where you are born determines your ultimate fate in life. Landlocked countries are, almost destined to be be failed states, if you will. A lot of these sort of conventional wisdom and shibboleths are being really overturned through various dimensions or instantiations of connectivity. And to me, given again the fact that this is a pattern that really has been building over thousands of years, to me it is in fact the most fundamental truth about our human interactions over time. Not that we are necessarily tribal and always seeking to splinter, although there is that, but even more fundamental is that we are always seeking to connect across those divisions to the extent that they exist at all. And that's really what, again, the history of the last 3,000 or 4,000 years in particular shows us when we look at the origins of diplomacy amongst Mesopotamian civilizations and tribes and so forth, the ancient Silk Roads and so forth. There has always been a desire to connect communities to the extent possible. So now, leapfrogging quite a bit. There's a couple of online or sort of web-based efforts that I've been supporting. This one is with Development Seed, which is an offshoot of Mapbox in Washington, which does a lot of work with the development community, with the World Bank and others, to help to deal with crisis situations, humanitarian disasters, and so forth. And what we've been doing is to put online, to combine in this way the various infrastructural layers. And if you log on to this site, you can sort of select and deselect and toggle and navigate around. And of course, it's a real struggle to update infrastructure data sets. Not only is there such an enormous volume of new activity that's going on, but some data sets are very sensitive. So try to get electricity grids, for example, from a utilities company. I've been threatened, actually, that if I were to put certain things online, I'd get sued and all this kind of stuff. Internet cable maps, right? Tough to come by. The terrestrial ones. The maritime cables are very easy to find, but there's a belief that there's less risk to them by putting their exact locations on maps. But the terrestrial ones are hard, and again, you'll be threatened by public agencies if you put it all online. But don't tell anyone, but they're pretty much always laid along railway tracks, all right? So you more or less know where the terrestrial cables are. But in any case, what I think efforts like this, and certainly those that again accumulate the layers and even animate them, get us closer and closer to a dream that I think we probably all share. And again, I guess you could add on other new technological disruptions like augmented reality and virtual reality, the ability to really navigate through in real time these layers of the world's geographic sort of categories, natural, political, and functional. And that's, I think we all share in that effort. Another one is being led by Jeff Blossom at Harvard at the Center for Geographical Analysis using their proprietary Harvard World Map base map. So we're also using this tool to update infrastructure data sets. Again, navigable, a bit more colorful, and so forth. I'm going to be showing you more of his maps as well. So the second mega trend that I see alongside connectivity is urbanization, right? Alongside infrastructure in the sense of trans-geographic connectivity is also the sort of stationary, if you will, pattern of human sort of civilizational development, and that is urbanization as a very organic and in many ways irrevocable megatrend, precisely because it is so organic, precisely because, again, over thousands of years we've seen that there is a sort of human desire, if you will, to congregate into urban conurbations and settlements such as have been mapped out here. Really, if you go back a step, at the risk of messing with the system, I want to go back so you can see just from 1950, how bright were the lights, if you will, as seen from space versus the year 2016. It's quite remarkable. So you've had a tripling of the world population since around World War II, but obviously a far larger degree of growth in the world economy and global electrification, urbanization, and so forth happening simultaneously. And so this, to me, is, again, a map, if you will, of functional geography. How are we, as humankind, using the space that is inhabitable in the world? And it's more revealing, in a way, to look at this demographic distribution than just to look at a political map on which, of course, there are no people, right, on our political maps. But we actually have it within our power to add that layer in there. I want to focus on urbanization because again, traditional political maps, those that, again, we default to, all cities are the same size black dots, right? A little black dot. But as you probably well know, but I think it will be memorably driven home right here, is that that many of the most significant cities in the world, those that are really reshaping the world economy and geopolitics, are not just little black dots, right? So we start in the Pacific Northwest, and you get this corridor that stretches from Vancouver down to Seattle. And the cross-border nature of these urban conurbations and megacity clusters is very, very significant because cities are increasingly drivers of economic decision-making and foreign policy and so forth. And so you see more and more a very pragmatic approach that cities have to collaborating across borders in terms of building combined shared infrastructure. Here we are, of course, in the Bay Area, and so what was just San Francisco to San Jose in terms of Silicon Valley of yore, the way it's spreading into Oakland and the way in which companies may be migrating, people as well, the broader population growing, this entire cluster, if you will, isn't one of the largest megacities in the world by any stretch of the imagination by population. No American city will meet that test, but obviously as an economic unit, right, and as an innovative unit and center, this is what it looks like. Then you've got Los Angeles through San Diego to Tijuana in Mexico. And here's another interesting example of the cross-border effects because there was an effort, or dialogue at least, and they perhaps almost got to the proposal stage of San Diego and Tijuana jointly bidding to host the 2024 Olympic Games or 2028 or something. So they haven't made that bid yet, but I think it will come. And again, it's an example of how functional geography sort of triumphs, if you will, or at least pragmatically reshapes the way we think about political geography, because ordinarily it would be one city in one country that wants to host the Olympics, right? Not a consortium of two cities across a international boundary. That's not happened before, but that's the kind of thing that is coming. Here we are on the East Coast of the United States, from Boston through New York, Philadelphia to Washington. We would those of us who are from the East Coast know this as the Amtrak corridor. Sadly, it still is just the Amtrak corridor. We don't have the high-speed railways that President Obama had rightly promised One of the maps that I found very significant right after his election was the proposed sort of 8 high-speed rail clusters that, again, if you think about it in the wake of the financial crisis, were the shovel-ready projects that would have had a pretty significant fiscal impact. But sadly, President Obama is no longer in the White House, and we have 0 kilometers of high-speed rail. But it would the efficiencies that would be brought, and again, one of the interesting things that location-based services are doing today is helping us to make the political case for greater infrastructure investment, because just in this corridor, you can start to quantify the cost and the economic drag that is lost, and the sort of productive time that is lost by sitting in traffic or by having trains break down and this kind of thing. And it is, hundreds of billions of dollars of lost activity. So now we migrate over to Asia, where we can see that the mega cities of the world, or the clusters, are not just populations of 10 or 15 million people, but more like 60 to 70 or 80 million people. A much larger scale, which of course is befitting for the global demographic picture, which is that most of the world's population lives, in fact, in Asia. So we're accustomed to thinking of Tokyo. This is the Tokyo-Osaka corridor. As the largest sort of megacity cluster in the world. This is most of Japan's population, most of its activity. But interestingly enough, according to The Economist, a survey, a special report that they did just a couple of months ago about the Pearl River Delta region, which I don't have that long extender stick thing. Here we go. Although I could just test all of you to see if you know which of these circles is the Pearl River Delta, but of course it is this one. According to The Economist, that is officially, the largest megacity cluster in the world now, a larger population than Greater Tokyo. And of course, it stretches actually from Guangzhou all the way down to Hong Kong. What's so interesting, again, about the relationship between functional geography and political geography is that it was 20 years and 3 months ago that Hong Kong did not even belong to China, of course. It was only handed over back from the British to China in July of 1997. But prior to that, and especially since that time, what you've seen is enormous investments in really bridging the sort of geographic, economic, infrastructural gaps between the cities of the Pearl River Delta, such that functionally it's really one economic system, and has become one, even though politically it is not one system. And so you have a projected economic value of this cluster. They say about $2 trillion, or moving towards $2 trillion by the year 2020. To put that in perspective, the total GDP of India today is $2 trillion, right? Now, if you were an astronaut in space circling the Earth, you wouldn't really know, you wouldn't be able to spot exactly Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta from space. You could certainly see India, but here you have in this, nearly invisible from space little conurbation, a GDP value that's that large. So what we're seeing today is where you have infrastructure investment, urbanization, demographics, and of course, productivity and economies moving up the value chain, that is so much more significant than just territorial size and political geography for shaping the future of power. The Beijing, Bohai Rim area to the top, Shanghai, and the Chongqing Chengdu cluster in central China round out the picture. But of course, I haven't put the map up in this show, but it's in the book. There is some work that's being done studying at Chinese administrative reorganization, and to me it's fascinating because you have an ancient civilization, 5,000 years of history, very distinct provincial linguistic histories, and yet they have still been able to impose an administrative reorganization of the country along these functional lines, where they're saying, yes, we are a sort of vertically integrated empire, and we do still have these 30 provinces, but equally important to understand China today, and particularly its political economy, is that it is officially 28 megacity clusters like this, right? And so much of the work that's going into Chinese economy, economic reform, infrastructure investment, economic strategy for new cluster development, all of that is based on those 28 cities, not on this province or that province, and the kind of political geography that obviously shapes the way spending is done in the United States, for example. Then you get into India, which, as I mentioned, in terms of GDP, stacks up as an entire country more or less against one Chinese megacity. So the total economy of India is still only about 1/7 that of 1/6 that of China, but its population by 2025 or so is estimated to surpass that of China. So you're looking at 1.4-ish billion people in India, but with very impressive growth rates and a very young population. It will not catch up in terms of GDP total size or per capita to China for a very long time, but it's clearly focused so much on urbanization for many of the reasons that I mentioned. So it isn't a surprise to me, given that there's really two major megacity clusters in India, the Delhi capital region and Mumbai, but 1.4 billion people. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that when Prime Minister Modi was elected, one of his campaign platforms was certainly infrastructure investment, and one of his first political platforms was this idea of 100 smart cities, which didn't mean 100 new cities. It meant taking at least 100 of India's many, many cities and getting their infrastructure up to speed. Better sewage systems, transportation, new business districts, all the kind of basics. And India today is spending about 20% of its annual budget just on infrastructure, which is a very, very high ratio, but a very necessary one given the population. I'm going to be coming back to the Arab world subsequently, but I just wanted to point out that this is one of the regions where political geography is of such limited utility given the very recent history of the actual existing state boundaries, whereas it is in fact a region of the world that has always been urbanized, right? Because it is the desert. So you are living in coastal oases that have now grown over time into the cities that they are. So the Arab world is about 400 million people. 90+% of Arabs live in cities. This is the Nile River Delta, so Cairo up to Alexandria. Egypt is the most populous Arab country, but most of its population is really clustered around here. You've got Greater Tehran up there. Iran's population is as large as Egypt's, and increasingly people are migrating northward towards that Greater Tehran region. This is the Persian Gulf sort of city-states. They call it the Arabian Gulf, of course. Just to be politically correct, I'll say both. But it's Bahrain, Qatar, stretching through Abu Dhabi and Dubai up to Muscat in Oman. And these are increasingly becoming, despite the rifts that they're experiencing right now, it has been in the process of integrating more and more infrastructurally into this sort of coastal cluster of cities. And this is, again, how you take very small, post-colonial, really feudal tribal monarchies and that have oil, but actually bring the population together with this new infrastructure investment into a new kind of economic order that they're building there, where services are playing a larger role increasingly, and they're actually preparing in some ways, or trying to prepare for a post-oil future. And Africa is interesting, and from a functional geography standpoint, because again, in terms of post-colonial political geography, you have 53 countries, many straight lines on the map, the likes of which we're always trained to be very suspicious of. But from a functional standpoint, because you have very little transcontinental infrastructure, when you map out the functional geography and the urbanization, and the economic sort of value creation of the geography of African economies, what it really comes down to understand Africa is three places. And that's the Gauteng province of South Africa, where Johannesburg and Pretoria are, the capital, Nairobi in Kenya, and Lagos. So Lagos, Nigeria, which lies in the western part of the country on the coast, is increasingly building sort of infrastructure corridors to the other West African countries immediately to its west, and building up that sort of corridor. So again, what matters more to understand where Africa has been? Of course, you don't want to ignore the fact that it's been parceled and partitioned into 53 countries. But if you want to understand how it operates today, you would actually be looking at these three urban clusters of Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Lagos, and you'd be looking at the radius of economic influence and gravity that these three have, because these are the hubs to which everyone is attracted. Everyone, so much of the African population is connected to these three cities, even if they never actually cross a border to go to those cities. These are where the supply chains really reach them from. So to kind of pan back, you get this sort of global image now of the 48 or so. Now this is taking projections from the World Bank and other sources that are looking out to 2030 and saying what are going to be the key urban demographic hubs of the future, and there's about, depending on which source you look at, anywhere from 45 to 50. So I've pointed them out for you here. What are the principal sort of economic areas or urban geographies? Again, much of the world is darkened out here, right? And the world has 200 countries. We have more countries than ever. When the UN was founded, it had 51 members. Today it has 200. But is that really what you need to understand complex dynamics in the world economy and geopolitics? Or do you need some additional layers of information, such as what are really the key urban economic hubs and what impact do they have in a cross-border sort of way? So, for example, you don't see Singapore, where I presently live, lit up here at all because it only has 5 million people. And again, by Asian standards, that's actually pretty small these days, right? Asia is 5 billion people and Singapore is just a tiny little place. So it's not even there as a megacity, but 75% of all the foreign investment that flows into ASEAN, which is a region of 800 million people, which has any number of megacities lit up here like Ho Chi Minh City, Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, and so forth, 75% of the investment that ultimately makes it to those megacities goes through one city that's not lit up here at all, right? Singapore. So these cities matter in some ways, not in others. Not being, when I show this slide in certain places, people say, for example, let's say when I present this in Australia, it's not lit up at all. So you can imagine Australians know that they're better at geography than most. They have some sense of how remote their geography is. So when I put this up in Australia, they're like, how come we're not lit up on your map? This is a disaster. Does this mean we don't matter in the 21st century? I say, no, calm down, relax. The fact is that being on this map isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, right? There are mega cities here where you don't really want to go, and Kinshasa is never going to be the center of the world economy, and you maybe don't want to spend a day and a half of your life driving from one end of Sao Paulo to the other, right? These megacities have lots of problems, but they're certainly, from let's say a business standpoint, right? They're critical markets. So whenever a company is looking at something like this, they can simply have a checklist and say, where are the cities where we're doing business and where do we need to do business? And that's why a functional map like this is useful. But for Australians, the combined population of Australia, it would fit into Jakarta, right? So of course they're not going to have any single particular megacity on this map, but it's still a very large, very relevant economy, very prosperous society. And of course its cities can share a lot of lessons, as Singapore does, with some of these larger cities because they're much better governed and managed. And part of what needs to be done, in fact, and I think that is in the next, jump forward here. Let me jump back. Yeah, part of what needs to be done, one of the principal lessons that does have to be learned, is how to dissipate our infrastructure investment to cope with the very large population size that we have in the world. So this is one of my favorites. This was done by Claire Trainer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's in the middle of Connectography. What we wanted to do, again, is to start with human demography, right? We wanted to say, well, first of all, again, I have a big problem with maps that get the scale of cities wrong and that ignore human life, right? And I don't think I'm asking for too much here to correct for these two things. So we started out by saying, hey, wait a minute, where are the people? So this is every human being in the world is a pixel on this map. So here you get a nice, accurate sense of global demographic distribution. Then you've got, again, these ovals are the megacity clusters, again, the 45, 50 of them. But here what we've added on is the larger circles that show you the economic value of a specific city relative to the national GDP. And that's where you start to see the distortions. I mean, the incredibly skewed political economy of of urban geography around the world. Even in advanced economies like the United Kingdom, you can see just what a significant role London plays in the national economy. The United States is better balanced, right? LA, well, the sort of West Coast corridor and East Coast together don't represent 50% of American GDP. It's more like about 30% between the two of them. But in developing countries, in a place like the Philippines or Indonesia, you'll have the capital city representing anywhere from 50% to 80% of the GDP of the country. But remember that those countries have anywhere from 100 to 250 million people, right? So in Indonesia, only the 20 million people who live in Jakarta represent most of the economic activity in a country of 200 million people. So what it is actually a warning sign that these countries are terribly underinvesting in all of the rest of their populations, and their populations are not really going to live up to their potential. We call them the next great dragon economies, and we have all sorts of pick the animal of your choice to describe what their anticipated economic performance is. They will never, ever live up to expectations unless these countries invest a lot more in the infrastructure in the second tier, third tier cities where those populations are. So again, we need the infrastructure to help us to explain whether or not the demographics actually matters. And then, of course, once you're in a city, what's so fascinating is that the cities it's very difficult for economists to quantify the endogenous economic value of a city. So much of what makes a city a thriving economic hub is the fact that much of its economic activity is comprised of transactions with other cities. And so I actually don't think that there is no good methodology, really. I mean, how would you, if you were in New York City or in London, how could you tease out that which is only indigenous economic activity, transactions only between people that has no relationship to international business travel, international supply chains, global manufacturing systems, and all of that sort of stuff. The internet and wherever the data may be stored in transactions, you would need to tease all of that out. I think quantum physics would be more helpful than economics as it is today to really try and figure out the actual value of a city economically independent of its connectivity role to other cities. And the larger a city becomes, the more that becomes the case. And of course, we're moving into a world of ever larger cities, which means that in a de facto sort of way, we're getting into much more complex global economic systems. I already talked through with the Pearl River Delta the shift from the political to the functional geography. And again, what we tried to do is to take the infrastructure corridors that have been developing from Hong Kong up to Guangzhou and map them. The same thing we did here for what's called the growth triangle between Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And again, the functional geography lens gives you a lot of insight into the way in which I would say maybe in particular Asian economies are starting to think, because we applaud them to some degree for their breakneck economic growth, but some of it has happened precisely because they've started to think beyond political geography. And this is a good example of that, because Singapore is a very small country. It has, to use economic factor inputs, very little land, very little labor, but it has lots of capital. Whereas its neighbor, Malaysia, has lots of land, quite a bit of labor, but less capital. And then you've got Indonesia, which has very little capital, but lots of land and lots of labor, right? And economics is about the optimization, actually, of land, labor, and capital. It's not about countries per se, right? The intrinsic unit in economics are the factor inputs of production, not a country as such. So starting 25 years ago, they said, let's figure out how we can optimize our differential land, labor, and capital inputs. Let's take, Singapore has the money to do shipbuilding, but it has no space to do shipbuilding. So let's locate shipbuilding on one of these islands. Let's do electronics on another island. Let's take advantage of cheap labor and space and proximity to a port where we can put the electronics on a ship. Let's do real estate and commercial developments somewhere else. And together what you find is that now the fastest growing geographies of these other countries are the ones that are closest to Singapore, even though they're not in Singapore. And Singaporeans are deriving a lot of their economic gains from their returns on investment, not from their own country, which has very low economic growth and a stagnant population, but from their investments in these high growth geographies that are adjacent to them. And the more they see the value in this kind of activity, the more they're building bridges across, because Singapore is an island, the more they're building bridges over, and now they're even planning a high-speed railway. And this is so significant because if you take the post-colonial world, which is most of the world, which is 150 countries in the world, and you start to look at the patterns of their cross-border relations over the last 70 years, since the end of World War II, you see this pattern repeating itself across boundaries between post-colonial countries. You see it happening here in Southeast Asia, where these high-speed railways and bridges and other infrastructures are being planned across borders of countries that were fighting very, very hostile wars through the 60s and 70s, right? Think about the Vietnam War. And today they're saying, well, that's all in the past, right? It takes a couple of generations for the political psychology to shift from the sort of very defensive, combative, hostile relations that these countries have with each other to a second generation that just wants to secure their sovereignty and focus internally on nation building, to a third generation of leaders, which is what basically all the post-colonial world has today in East Africa, parts of the Middle East, certainly in Southeast Asia. This third generation that has no living memory of World War II and of decolonization, but really wants to provide for their people and wants to participate in global supply chains and realizes that they can't do it without connecting to their neighbors. So I see this as a very positive story, and the reason that Southeast Asia is such a huge growth market today. In fact, ASEAN, the 10 countries of ASEAN get more foreign investment than all of China does today, with half the population. No one country in Southeast Asia could ever compete with China, right? But if you combine the 10 of them together and bring their supply chains and their labor markets together, they can compete, and they are competing extremely well. It's because Southeast Asia is the region of the world next to Europe that is most aggressively pursuing this cross-border integration. So speaking of Europe, I might need to speed up a little bit. Do I?
Like 5 minutes.
Oh,
5
okay.
to 8 minutes.
Oh man, I've got a few more maps to get through. Okay.
You can fudge it to 10.
Okay, cool. There was a lot that I wanted to say with this, but I'll boil it down to just a couple of things. This is a map of the oil and gas pipeline network of Western Europe. Now, I mean, Europe is in many ways an egg that cannot be unscrambled. If you look at the currency, we're coming up on 10 years since the financial crisis. Which began here in many ways, but certainly affected Europe very, very hard. Southern European economies like Greece, people have predicted would be tossed out of the Eurozone. No such thing has happened because, like the energy grid of Europe, you really can't unscramble that egg. So European countries have a very hard time figuring out where their energy, or knowing where it comes from. So I give the example of Germany after the Fukushima nuclear crisis. Again, also a great complexity story because after Fukushima, a number of countries like Germany said, we want to go non-nuclear, right? We were going to phase out our nuclear power industry. So assuming they do that, guess where Germany will be importing its power from? France. France gets its power from nuclear. Can Germany go non-nuclear? No, it really can't. Now, that said, Germany is doing great things with grid parity through its investments in solar and wind, and they're to be applauded for that. But at the moment, they do import French nuclear power. So they're not really non-nuclear. The other thing that I really wanted to show with this, though, and the purpose of the creation of this map in the first place, was a very, very significant geopolitical one, which is Russia. Because people have, many have pointed out that Russia is one of the primary sources of energy for Europe and exercises a tremendous amount of leverage over Europe. But what's so interesting, what's happening right now in the Ukraine dynamic is that Russia persistently, even before the crisis of 2014 and the seizure of Crimea down there, has threatened and executed oil and gas cutoffs to Ukraine. But when you really look at the way in which the gas pipeline network is developing, such as the controversial Nord Stream pipeline and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that's being built from Russia directly to Germany, what you find is that even if Russia wants to cut off the flow of Russian gas to Ukraine, what's happening is that the gas that's flowing to Germany is being recirculated back through Poland to Ukraine. And that's called reverse flows. So even when the Kremlin wants to cut off a sort of an errant neighbor, it can't cut it off because it at the same time wants to profit from selling gas to Germany, and Germany just turns around and sells it on. So I've been going to Russia a fair bit recently, and I've asked people in the Kremlin, I was like, don't you mind that this is happening, right? That your principal energy partner in Europe is Germany, and you're you're trying to strangle your neighbor Ukraine, and Germany is just reselling your gas to Ukraine. And it turns out that they're not so loyal to that geopolitical, domination of Ukraine. They just want to make money. And they say, oh, well, so long as it's being sold at the right price, that's all. But the real message of this when it comes to cartography, could you possibly understand the geopolitics between Russia and Ukraine only by looking at the political boundaries? I mean, oil and gas pipelines is precisely what, to a large degree, not just history and Putin's Stalinist ambitions. A lot of people like to put things in those terms, but it is fundamentally actually about the control over infrastructure, especially when you're talking about energy powers. So I believe that we should look at the situation that way, because that is exactly how the protagonists and antagonists are looking at it. But we're not using maps of these infrastructures to explain these conflicts, which is part of the reason we're getting it so wrong. Now, this is another one. This is literally the most significant, geopolitical trend of the 21st century is here on this map. And of course, there are no tanks, there are no aircraft carriers on this map. There's just pipelines and railways. And this is, of course, what I mean by this is China's Belt and Road Initiative, right? So I've been traveling to every country on this map for 20 years or so, and asking the governments, what are the major projects that you have underway? Which neighbors do you need to connect to? What are the sectors that you're trying to grow? What do you want China to build for you with all the money that they're pouring into your country? And out comes this map, which is, and a lot of these infrastructures are already in place. And a lot of the things that are being built I haven't even put up here, like ultra high voltage DC power transmission lines to create a pan-Asian energy grid, for example, and so forth. And so the way in which this infrastructural integration is proceeding, and it's interesting, the Chinese Party Congress is going on right now, and again, Belt and Road is front and center in China's vision for itself in the world. They're not saying we are, once again, the Middle Kingdom set to, conquer all of our neighbors. They're actually saying infrastructure is a global public good, and we are exporting this service and elevating everyone together. And interestingly enough, 70 or 80 countries completely buy into that, and that's exactly what's happening. If you go to Pakistan, to Kazakhstan, even to Russia, I mean, every country has its suspicions of China, but every country also desperately needs this infrastructure, because again, you're looking at a lot of post-Soviet, post-colonial countries that are fundamentally broken, physically broken, and their populations have grown substantially, and they have not been able to cope. And now along comes China with the assets that are helping them do so. And along the way, what you get is a Eurasian economy, rather than Asia being way over there on the eastern end of the landmass and Europe over here as a western peninsula. Really what's happening in the next 10, 20 years is them coming together through these seamless corridors. And as you may know, you can put 8 Hewlett-Packard laptops onto high-speed trains, and within 10 days now they're going to arrive through Kazakhstan and Russia. They're going to arrive in Germany, right? And in the reverse direction now, you've got French wine, Spanish ham, baby formula, all sorts of things going to meet Asian demand. So this is a very significant geopolitical factor is embedded in the trade patterns. It's an article of faith in geopolitics that the transatlantic relationship, the U.S. and Europe, is the most intense interregional trade pattern in the world, and it's part of what underpins, alongside values and history, the transatlantic alliance. And the value of that annually is about $1 trillion of trade. Guess what the trade is between the European Union and Asian countries, just the major ones, just China, India, Japan, Korea, ASEAN? It's way more. And that tells you, if you knew that number, if you knew that it was $1.7 trillion, which is a lot more than trade between Europe and America, you would have no difficulty in understanding why, when President Obama called up every single European leader and encouraged them not to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China founded, they all hung the phone up on him, right? That's exactly what they did. And they all joined the bank, right? It's an Asian and a European bank, effectively. All you needed to know was that number and to look at this, right? And to look at the potential for the economic activity going on between Europe and Asia. Oh, wait, I gotta go back. Okay, pop quiz before the next one. In this age of threats of putting up walls between the US and Mexico and increased difficulty of crossing the Canadian border, how many annual border crossings are there between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico? Pop quiz. If you're watching online, you can vote too. Very important because, we've had 2 years now of this presidential election and this administration. Been hearing about, swarms of people crossing this border illegally and so forth. You would think that it was, and yet in all of this political discourse about illegal migration across the border, not one person that I heard, whether on Fox or CNN or elsewhere, ever actually pointed out to the number of people who legally, legitimately, every day, cars, bicycles, on foot, in trucks, cross the U.S., Canada, and U.S., Mexico border in a year. Can I have a guess, please? 300 million? Well, that'd be a bit over. But anyone?
2 million.
75 million.
No, closer. Okay, so I'll give you the facts here. So, 50 million U.S. Canada crossings every year, 35 million U.S. Mexico crossings a year. These are the two most heavily trafficked borders on the planet Earth, and they always will be. Always, right? There will never. I mean, I've been to the Russian-Chinese border enough times. No, it's not. Even with all the Chinese who want to go and hang out in Lake Baikal, it's not going to add up to that much. We don't appreciate how lucky we are to have two neighbors like this, to have such an intense, enormous volume of physical cross-border activity, human passages across these borders, because we don't know the data, we don't map it out, we don't look at the interdependencies in the energy sector and the transportation sector, in the specific industries from auto parts to lumber and so forth between these three countries in North America. But we're incredibly blessed to have neighbors like this with which we actually share such incredible complementarity. So the purpose of this map, which is again from Jeff Blossom, is to map out some of those relationships and even to forecast what might eventually what sort of hydrological agreements might look like if we needed to take Canadian water. The very sensitive issue between the U.S. and Canada is water transfer agreements, but to start to use potentially Canadian water to replenish American aquifers and so forth. I have to jump ahead, but I wanted to talk a little about migration. This is again one of these issues around the misperceptions in our present political discourse versus the reality. We talk about Brexit and walls going up and stopping migration as if that's actually happening, but nothing of the sort is happening. We have more people crossing borders every day and every year than ever in history. Billion people crossing borders every single year, and most human migration has nothing to do with us, meaning North America, right? Or not even with Europe. Most human migration is across post-colonial countries. And nothing that's happening in Western politics, whether it's elections in France and Germany or Donald Trump, will have even the slightest impact on that, right? And if you look at the real geography of human migration and map it out in this way, you start to see how inexorable the trend actually is and how vast the sums are growing. This also shows you actually remittance value across those transactions. I won't have time. I already said a bit of what I wanted to say about the Middle East, but part of the point here, and this is another one from the book, was to actually map out again some of the proposed cross-border functional infrastructures of railways, electricity grids, pipelines, and so forth that would help the Arab world to find a better map, if you will, than the very arbitrary map of political geography that was inherited or imposed upon it in the sort of interwar years in particular. And I think again, it's most easy in the Arab world to do this sort of conceptually. Because that has been much more the history of the region, because it's in fact been dominated by very large-scale empires, the caliphates, the Ottoman Empire, and so forth, that were very trans-geographic and did not focus on rigid political boundaries. And so the political geography is part of the prison, if you will. It's very dangerous to publicly propose maps for the future of the Middle East. It's one of these areas that can also earn you a lot of hate mail and death threats. But I'll go on the record saying I'm a supporter of an independent Kurdistan, even though that doesn't appear to be happening right now. Last couple of maps. This was one that I did put online. This was made by the British journal, The New Scientist, and they had done some early work on looking at what would happen to global agricultural production if the world temperature rises 4 degrees Celsius above the 1990 baseline used by the IPCC. And as many of you know, we seem to be approaching somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of that right now. And beyond 2 degrees, certain effects might be locked in. What's so interesting here is that you've got the world's largest food producing countries of today, such as the United States, Brazil, India, China, Australia, effectively being totally desertified. And you have the Canada and Russia becoming the two largest food producing centers in the world, which are obviously two very large depopulated countries. The Arctic Circle runs a bit north of that sort of green line, if you will. Does anyone know what the population of the Arctic Circle is today? In the entire, the top 1/3 of the spherical, the cone of the Earth, how many people live in that geography? It's less than 5 million people live in the entire Arctic Circle. And by 2040, perhaps, this could be where all our food comes from. So the reason I use this map is to kick off a conversation, and obviously I knew going into it what a provocative one it would be. What happens when climate change necessitates very significant human migration shifts, right? And when we need more people to move north to work the agricultural supply chains to feed the world. Now, Canada is a very progressive conversation about this. They have a strategy called Canada 100 Million. It's not an official government document. It's more of a white paper that has not been rejected in any way. If anything, if you look at Canada's openness to immigration, you see that they're clearly moving in that direction because LiDAR satellite data has shown us just how much more rapidly the northern latitudes of Canada are producing a wheat crop, for example, and so forth, and how quickly the permafrost is melting. So, like it or not, Canada and Russia are already actually, I mean, year on year, if you look at the agribusiness patterns in both countries, there are two sectors that are growing, or one sector that's growing very rapidly in both countries. So I'm going to stop right there, but obviously there's a lot more that could be said about the ways in which we can use cartography, obviously, to bring to life some of the very, very important, and I wanted to focus today on, again, to my mind, some of the big geopolitical, economic kind of questions that are very, very consequential. And I know that in the next couple of days you'll be talking about some of those as well. Again, my hope, my aspiration is that we're able to combine not only the natural, the political, and the functional layers, but also to, in a way, three-dimensionalize them, to be able to capture the either the demographic data, even looking at things like human social capital, education levels, incomes in a three-dimensional way, overlaying on that geography. There's plenty of examples of that. Al Gore, does that in his TED Talks and so forth. So we know we can do that. But I think the motion maps are really critical because I work a lot on supply chains of specific industries. So being able to see exactly where in the process of a supply chain of a particular good, where the resources are, where they're coming from, where they're going, where they're being processed. This is very critical today for those who are looking, for example, at the impact of 3D printing on global supply chains. So how is it going to shift resource consumption? And again, you can already capture all of that data in a very real-time way. To map it and then to build scenarios and project forward around it will be so revealing for all of us who work in policy, who are trying to figure out where should investments be made, where are people going to be moving, what are the sectors we should be training our labor force for. Very, very practical questions. We can get a better handle on the complexity that decision makers face in politics in every country in the world. We will do a better job of making those decisions rather than shooting from the hip, which we do quite a lot of these days. And it is, in fact, the case that better cartography, right, the more effort, the more resources we put into it, is going to be a very essential part of those solutions. So I hope that that is a kickoff for everyone for this couple of days. Again, I'm deeply, deeply honored to be with you this evening, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Questions for Parag? There's a microphone over there. You can just walk over.
Maybe in the meantime, just grab the mic.
Thank you. Okay. Well, first off, I want to thank you for just an utterly fantastic and inspiring talk. I think, first off, you probably have a very appreciative audience, since most of us are geographers and cartographers here. My name is Benjamin Sachs. I'm a final year doctoral candidate at Princeton working in history and geography. And this leads into my question, which is the ideas you propose, and I think some of which has already been acted on, are fantastic. The difficulty, I see it, is actually trying to demonstrate and teach these paradigm shifts to larger populations, not just at universities, but in primary and secondary education. So the idea is, these are great ideas, using data, remapping, changing the paradigm away from political geography, more into connectivity, more into the network functional geography. But how do we actually convey that to 10 or 12-year-olds? How do we actually convey that to people who are in American high schools? As you know as well as I do, the United States doesn't teach geography. And those students who actually are seriously interested in geography, usually they have to teach themselves. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts on how do we take what we've learned here today and we actually are able to educate many more Americans about this. Thank you.
That's a great question. And, because of the way American education system works, they're not all curricula, are nationalized, standardized, and schools, the public and private divergence, makes it hard to give a sort of overarching answer in terms of even giving examples of what's being done, because very little is national in that sense, unlike in other countries. But, I do see that obviously because kids are so enamored with technology, when you develop these micro modules or curricula around having kids go out with OpenStreetMap, for example, and plot out locations and generate maps from that. I'm seeing that happening in schools, for example. A better updating or more frequent updating of the AP geography curriculum, such as what's happening with the International Baccalaureate in the IB system and IB schools worldwide, which obviously dominates the rest of the world, but not the US. IB geography is extremely popular. I do talks I never want to pass up a chance. In fact, I try never to miss a chance to speak to specifically high school students in geography classes. But guess what? None of them are in the US, right? It's I've Skyped into girls' schools in Northern England just to talk to them about connectography and stuff, because there's an interest in IB systems and A levels that's not foundational here, not required here. It's not a mandatory subject in secondary schools. It's not part, but you could start just by the curricula that you can shape that affect large numbers of students. So social science, civics, right? insinuating geography into those, I think would be the right place to start. And then perhaps having that cool factor of the iPad, go out and plot places. I mean, I see my own daughter is only 8, but they do a lot of this in her school. And I think that gets kids excited, and then at least you'll get some basic conceptual appreciation of geography as a starting point.
We're just liberating the microphone. Thank you. I loved the maps, and some of them were very compelling. I'm wondering, since you travel around the world a lot, you cited a lot of facts, which are, I think, very persuasive to people like us, but at least in this country, facts actually are not very persuasive. Whereas images are extremely persuasive and authentic. And I think that there are things like the map of migrations across these borders that could really reach people that don't like to pay attention to facts. And I'm wondering, in your experience, are there other countries and other media organizations that use these maps effectively to educate the kind of people who look at the news every day?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It dovetails very nicely with the other one. Again, I think there's just a historical and just inherent sort of maintenance of geography as a key subject, right, in a lot of systems. In England, in Germany, I went to high school in Germany briefly, and Erdkunde, as it's called, right, earth science, is a mandatory discipline. So you don't, they're always thinking about how to update curricula. So in that sense, it's built in. When you're talking about media, there again, it's a very private, fragmented picture. Hard to say. I think really what's very important here is the rise of online social media and the way in which a lot of news organizations are trying to use infographics and sometimes maps to really grab people's attention. So the 5 charts you need to understand why Trump won. Or the 5 charts you need to understand Brexit. And I see lots and lots of this circulating on the internet because it is inherently, sure, media organizations want to grab eyeballs, and they also want to make things, they want to deal with the attention deficit disorder of their readers. But that's actually leading to a positive thing, which is the rise of these sort of, if you will, digestible infographics and maps that media organizations are devising to get people to keep their eyeballs on the screen. So a variety of sort of negative factors, if you will, just relentless media competition to provoke and to grab attention, and to do things in a concise way are leading to a situation where actually it's a good market for cartographers, right, and for infographic designers, because the burden or the impetus, the onus, the opportunity actually falls to you to use the knowledge, the skills that you have in terms of developing map-based graphics to serve that educational function. And I think maybe that's a call for more cross-pollination, maybe between those who have the facts, the academic the information, and the ability to present it, to get it out there in front of to the media, because they actually want it. There's a sort of desperate hunger, almost, to have quality content. So I would hope that could tip the needle a little bit and make, if you make facts so sort of undeniably visible, one would hope that could help to change the discourse a little bit.
Question about connectivity. So many people don't understand that word, at a lower level. We can talk about all this, and those of us in the room get this. But you talk to somebody on the street, or somebody looking at whatever the news media is saying, but what does that mean for me? Because it's all about me, and what I'm doing, not about this kind of stuff, or even talking to you, and how do we connect with just another person, and then how do we make it bigger?
It's a great question, and look, we noticed this now with our own election, this mismatch between how a simple explanation of connectivity could change the way people think, and its lack of success in doing so. And again, Trump and Brexit are really good examples. I remember before the election, Obama went on like Jimmy Kimmel Live or one of those late night shows, and he did this slow jam. Do you remember this, where he was like kind of singing a tune, and he made it, and part of it was about global trade. And he said, again, this is like set to music, but I'm not a vocal, I'm not a musical person. But he said, when it comes, basically, Jimmy, when you invest in, in jobs and economic growth abroad, you're actually raising wages and incomes, and those people become consumers of our exports. So it's a virtuous circle. And in one sentence, Barack Obama on a late night talk show managed to explain a fundamental truth about, global trade and its benefits to American workers that actually half of our Congress doesn't seem to understand the basic economics of this. So, unfortunately, I do think there's not only a geographic illiteracy, in much of the country, and certainly, again, in the political class as well, but obviously an economic one also, sort of Econ 101, Geography 101. Everyone needs to go back and do those so that we could get some of these things right. Again, some of the numbers that I never heard in the campaign were not only about our cross-border migration patterns with our neighbors, but also the number of American workers that actually depend on trade for their jobs, so export-related jobs. But then also, equally significant, foreign investment-related jobs, the number of Americans whose jobs are actually financed by foreign capital inflows into the United States, which is an equally large percentage of the American workforce. These are not debatable facts, right? But if they are, I don't hear them stated publicly, even by the people who know them. I don't see that, those voices entering the political fray. And And you could map them out very nicely. Brookings has done some really good work on cross-border supply chains between major cities. So the relationship again between Los Angeles and Toronto, or Vancouver and Houston. They've mapped all that out, looking at in industries like auto parts, pharmaceuticals, technology, and so forth. These are really good infographics. These are really good that we should be putting out there, and just, you've got to basically bludgeon people with them if you want to get them to understand. But, it does take that one-on-one conversation. It's going to take an army of educated people going door to door, because of the way our political system does in fact work, and it is what it is. So we have to work on those terms. And I've seen, politicians, I gave you the Obama example, who's more prominent than him, and he said it to an audience of tens of millions. It still doesn't really work. You've got to say it over and over in front of all these audiences. I have friends in other countries who are, a friend of mine who's a minister in Australia, and when he goes to the local, shopping mall, to the grocery store, and they say to him, globalization, I don't want to lose my job, forget it. So it's a real uphill battle.
Over here.
I may have misunderstood what you said toward the beginning of your talk when you I think you were downplaying the effect of tribalism. I'm not sure about that, because I see that countries formed because of tribalism, and I think it's a very powerful thing, and it may be affected by religion, by connectivity, but I'm doubting your dismissal of it as a potent force.
Oh, I don't want to dismiss it at all. If anything, and there's a big chunk of the book devoted to the idea of devolution, right? Devolution as the sort of fragmentation of political authority, and one of the main drivers of devolution is in fact what we think of as tribalism, nationalism, and so forth. Whether it is again state formation throughout history, again undeniable that tribalism, if we want to call it that, or nationalism, ethno-nationalism, and religious identity have played critical roles in that, and then the driving force in that. So in fact, I completely agree. But I'm saying it's an incomplete picture for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's equal and opposite tendencies, such as urbanization, right? And the larger cities become, the more they are actually diverse, right? And reflective of diverse identities coming together. So I have a map in the book that shows you the percentage of foreign-born populations in some of the largest cities in the world. And what you find is that the great cities in the world today, whether it's New York, Toronto, London, Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, these are all places that have anywhere from 40 to 60% of their populations being foreign-born. And these are obviously the driving economic and political centers of their countries and entire regions. So clearly, it is not the only human impulse. I'm not trying to be dismissive of ethno-nationalism, but clearly it's not our only basic impulse, because we are organically and voluntarily moving into these cities and voluntarily joining these environments that are actually very much ethnic fusions, if you will. So that's one. The second is that even if you fully accept and embrace and celebrate tribalism, and again, the funny thing was when I mentioned Kurdistan up there, full disclosure, I've supported and been on the boards of organizations that actively support secessionist movements, right? I'm a big believer in independent Kurdistan, Palestine, even if in Catalonia, if that's what they want, although they should obviously do it fairly. And the reason is for the following, that the smaller polities become, the less they can actually have any autarky, right? So the more tribalism you have, the more connectivity you have. The reason we have so much cross-border infrastructure today, and the reason countries desperately need it, is because our countries are getting smaller and smaller because of devolution and tribalism. So a small country cannot provide for its own food, fuel, water, economic goods and services. So they have absolutely no choice but to be more connected to each other. So there's this very, very paradoxical logic at the heart of an ever more connected world. It's that this ever more connected world has the maximum number possible of tribal units. So I actually completely celebrate there's, in fact, the chapter of the book is titled "Let the Tribes Win," and it's called that for a reason, because once every tribe gets its own state, you more or less eliminate international border conflicts, and that's actually what's happened today. There are almost no meaningful international border conflicts today. The reason is not because we're all democracies, because we're not. There's even democratic backsliding going on in the world. Democracy is not the reason why we have a decline in international boundary disputes. The reason we have a decline in international boundary disputes is because we have had so many boundary conflicts that for ethno-nationalists and other reasons that we've created so many states, and once you create a state, you've actually settled a boundary, and there's one less boundary to fight over. So I just think it's a lot more complicated than simply saying, which is, again, the way in which it's so often portrayed, and whether it's political science or the media, there's this default notion that the most basic, sort of truth and instinct and sort of paradigm is the ethno-nationalist sort of tribal state unit, but it's not, because there's a lot of other factors at play and consequences to that tribalism that become more important than the tribalism.
Matthew, I think?
I had a question actually to ask. In terms of data available, are there psychographics on the emerging global identities that we're seeing that do cross all borders? The next generations who are identifying with solving global warming. And in answer to the question about teaching the next generations is demanding this already. And I'm wondering if we aren't misassessing the need in terms of understanding what is going to stimulate that growth of international identities. And is it available in the data already? Emerging identities around global warming, around any other major, who are we going to be in the future? And what are those new identities going to be, and how can we graphic that?
I think those are great questions. So I think there's two answers. One lies in the area of social network analysis, and our ability to take the various streams of information that we have. You call them psychographics, and to use as proxies, if you will. So sentiments that are issued that are online, Twitter feeds and so forth, geolocating by country, by city, by age group, and starting to see what sort of patterns emerge, and also obviously what bubbles we can create around the transgeographic linkages and try and correlate them by generational, decile of age and so forth. There is a lot of work in that regard in social network analytics going on, and I think it's very cool and interesting. And it's one of the by far one of the most difficult areas, to visualize in a way that superimposes itself nicely onto geography. Right? It's much easier to just use bar charts or whatever and say, the number of, for example, the number of international Facebook friends that people have. I have a chart about that somewhere. It shows over time the average number of Facebook friends that someone has that are from another country has increased, sort of threefold on average across a set of countries that have been chosen. It's difficult to visualize that on a map per se, right? It's much easier to just have a graphic that doesn't have a map base. But I think it would be cool to find that fusion. Now, the second answer is actually one that's based actually on the results of a lot of these surveys, where you've asked what are those common sentiments. So BBC and GlobeScan did this sort of fairly comprehensive global surveying of millennials to try and tease out what are their sort of values and sort of priorities in a wide range of areas. And they found that things like connectivity as a human, or sort of internet access as a human right, right to migration, human rights and transparency in government, political participation. They found a bunch of these sort of common values across countries: north, south, east, west, rich, poor, and so on. And so they called it the study the first globals. It's the first time where you can say that there is some consistent sentiment. It's not universal, right? Not all, Iraqis and Mexican 20-year-olds feel the same way about these things. But you're starting to see in the results a pretty substantial percentage of the populations of countries, young populations, expressing similar sentiments about these common values. And so for the first time, you can say that not only are there aspirational universal values, meaning it would be great to end slavery and it would be great to have universal human rights as we've had in the past, but you actually have actively within that same generation people who naturally believe those things. So they've done some pretty good work. I cite it in the book. And what's I think final point that's super interesting is that the percentage of the populations, one of the questions that they were asked is, do you think of yourself as a global citizen? And of course that term doesn't actually have any agreed upon meaning, but that they let the surveyees sort of interpret it however they like. And they found that the percentage of respondents who identify themselves as global citizens is higher in developing countries than even in rich countries. So we have this cosmopolitan bias, right? We think there's this Davos man, and that Davos man who comes from Switzerland or America or London and is a hedge fund trader and has 5 passports, that person is the global citizen, right? And that person is sort of divorced from the ground realities of tough, sort of countries and nationalism being more important forces. What you find with the millennials is that a higher percentage of people in developing countries identify as global citizens and view that as one of their identities. And I actually think it's very easy to explain, because if you come from a large, poor, developing country that may have obviously some sense of identity, but it's not a fulfilling one to you, right? Because your state is a failed state. Your government is not providing for you. You actually really aspire to belong to something greater than, say, Egypt today, right? Which is kind of falling apart, right? As are a lot of other places. So you find that in Nigeria, in India, in Pakistan, that's where the highest number of young kids are saying, oh, I definitely feel like I'm a global citizen. Like there's something more for me than just being an Indian and being confined to this place. And of course, they wouldn't be able to have that sense as much if they didn't have the kind of technological connectivity and access to information in order to derive or download, if you will, this sense of identity from what they're seeing happening outside of their own boundaries, outside of their own borders, even if they never actually get to leave the country in which they were born.
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there. We're about 15 minutes over, so I know we're just starting this fantastic discussion. We have a full day tomorrow, and we start bright and early at 9 tomorrow. So thank you again, Parag.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.